left for the wolves, the cowboy who refused to ride away. His boots pressed into the soft earth, and the cool morning air carried the scent of dew and wild grass. For John, mornings were always the same, yet each one felt alive, full of promise and challenge. At 25, he had already spent more than half his life riding horses, tending cattle, and living under the wide sky. The plains were his home, his world, and nothing could pull him away from them. Not danger, not money, not fear. John had grown up on a ranch not far from this one. His father had taught him everything about hard work, about how to read the land, about how to handle a horse or a stubborn steer. When his father passed, John inherited a strong love for the land and a stubborn determination to protect it. Unlike many young men who might have left for the towns or the cities, John stayed. He could see the beauty in the empty stretches, in the way the sun painted gold over the hills at evening, and he could feel the life in the soil under his hands. He believed that leaving was not an option. This land was more than grass and dirt. It was his family, his history, and his future. The small ranch he worked on was simple: a weathered wooden house, a barn, a corral, and a few pastures stretched out over the land. It was not rich or fancy, but it was enough. John worked with a few other hands, but most of the younger men had already left. They were afraid of the gang that had been moving through the territory in recent months, stealing cattle and threatening anyone who tried to stop them. The gang had a fearsome reputation, and towns across the plains whispered their stories. Many ranchers had sold their land and left. Others had gone into town, hoping to hide in the shadows of safer streets, but John refused. He refused to run. That morning he started his chores quietly. The horses were restless, sensing the movement of something in the distance. John spoke to them softly, patting their necks, checking their saddles, and leading them out to the pasture. He fed the cattle and repaired a fence that had been damaged by the last storm. Each task was familiar, but he performed them with care and attention. John understood that every detail mattered. A broken fence could mean a lost steer. A frightened horse could turn a day's work into disaster. As he worked, he thought about the warnings he had received. Neighbors had knocked on his door, advising him to sell the ranch and leave. "It's not safe, John," one of the older ranchers had said. "Those men will come and you won't be able to stop them. Take your life while you can." But John had only smiled and shaken his head. "This is my land," he had said. "I won't abandon it." His stubbornness did not make him reckless. John knew the risks. He had seen what the gang could do. He had heard stories of families forced to flee at night, of barns set on fire, of cattle stolen and sold for a pittance. But he also knew that running meant leaving everything behind: the land, the work, the pride of seeing a herd safe and healthy. There was something more powerful than fear driving him. It was love. Love for the life he had built, for the animals that depended on him, for the land that had given him everything. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed higher, and the wind began to pick up, blowing dust across the fields. John paused for a moment, leaning on his shovel, and looked out across the land. The horizon stretched endlessly, dotted with hills and the occasional tree. He could see the faint trails where wild animals moved and the tracks of men and horses that sometimes passed through. He squinted, thinking he saw movement in the distance. It could have been nothing, or it could have been trouble. Either way, he would face it. After finishing the chores, John went to the barn to check on his supplies. He made sure the feed was secure, the tools were organized, and the weapons he kept for protection were clean and ready. He did not like violence, but he knew the plains required preparation. A man could not rely solely on luck. He had to be ready, or the land and animals he cared for could be lost in an instant. As he walked back toward the house, he noticed a bird perched on a fence post, its head cocked curiously as it watched him. John smiled, feeling a strange connection to the creatures that shared his land. He often thought about how life on the plains was a constant balance. Danger was everywhere, from the elements, from animals, and from men who saw nothing but opportunity. Yet in that balance there was also beauty, and John felt proud to be a part of it. Later that day, he rode out to check on the distant pastures. The horse beneath him moved easily over the rough terrain, and John felt the familiar rhythm of riding through the land he knew so well. As he approached a small stream, he noticed tracks along the bank. At first glance, they looked like ordinary deer prints, but on closer inspection, he realized there were human footprints as well. They were recent. His heart tightened, not from fear, but from a growing sense of responsibility. The gang was near, closer than he had imagined. John returned to the ranch, thinking quickly. He began reinforcing the fences and securing the barn doors. He stacked hay in strategic places to block entry and set traps along the edges of the property. Each move was careful, deliberate, a silent statement that he would not surrender without a fight. The work was exhausting and the sun was setting, but John did not stop. He was determined to be ready. That night, as he sat by the fire in his small house, John thought about the choices that had brought him here. Many men might have seen the same tracks and decided to leave, to ride away into the safety of towns far from danger. But John knew that leaving would be like abandoning a part of himself. He could not do it. He felt a deep, unshakable connection to the land, and he believed that staying and defending it was the only honorable path. Sleep came late that night. John lay on his simple bed, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks in the walls. He imagined the faces of the gang, their eyes cold and their intentions cruel. He thought about the cattle, the horses, and the simple ranch that depended on him. He felt both fear and determination, a strange mixture that kept him awake and alert. He was alone, but he was ready. In the early hours just before dawn, John rose and stepped outside. The sky was painted in shades of pink and gold, and the world seemed peaceful, almost serene. But John knew better. Danger was coming whether the plains looked calm or not, and yet he smiled, feeling a quiet pride. He was a cowboy, a protector of his land, and he would not ride away. Not now, not ever. That morning, John's resolve was clear. He went about his chores with purpose, checking every corner, every fence, every animal. He spoke softly to his horses, giving them comfort and strength. He felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, but he also felt alive in a way few men ever did. The land was harsh, the threats were real, but this was the life he had chosen, and he would face it with courage. By the time the sun had fully risen, John was in the corral, watching the cattle graze. He felt the wind against his face and the warmth of the day, and he knew that whatever came, he would meet it head-on. The plains were wide and open, the air fresh and clean, but the shadows of danger were never far. Yet John McCall, the cowboy who refused to ride away, was ready. The land was his, the animals were his, and he would defend them all, no matter the cost. The story of a man who would not abandon his home had begun, and the plains themselves seemed to acknowledge it. Every hoofbeat, every rustling leaf, every distant bird called out a silent affirmation. John belonged here, and in that belonging he found strength that would carry him through the days to come, through the threats and the storms, through the nights filled with uncertainty. For John McCall, the choice was simple. The world could try to chase him away, the wolves could circle, the gang could come. But he would not leave. This land was his, and he would stay. He would fight. He would endure. And when the world tried to push him down, he would rise, steadfast as the mountains, relentless as the wind, and unyielding as the plains themselves. The days after John's decision to stay on the ranch were filled with a tense, restless energy. Each morning, he woke before dawn, the chill of the Wyoming plains cutting through the thin walls of his cabin. The wind seemed louder than usual, carrying with it the faint sounds of the wild, birds calling, cattle lowing, and somewhere in the distance, the unmistakable rustle of movement. John did not know yet whether it was the wind playing tricks or the first signs of trouble, but he did not allow himself the luxury of worry. Instead, he prepared. He spent the mornings inspecting the fences, walking along every boundary, making sure no gap was left unattended. He reinforced the barn doors with extra planks, piled hay against weak spots, and even dug shallow trenches around the property to slow any intruders. These were small, careful measures, but they gave John a sense of control. He had always believed that preparation was more powerful than fear. Each nail hammered, each post tightened, and each tool sharpened was a silent message. I am here. I will not run. The cattle were restless, sensing something in the air. John moved among them, guiding the calves back toward the pasture and calming the older cows with his steady voice. He knew animals could sense danger before humans could, and he trusted their instincts as much as his own. His horse, a sturdy bay named Rust, nickered at him when he approached, and John ran a hand down its neck. "We'll get through this," he whispered. Together, there was comfort in the routine, the familiar rhythm of caring for the land and animals, but there was also a creeping tension, a sense that change was coming whether he liked it or not. It was on the third day after the first warnings that John noticed the tracks. He had ridden out early, scouting along the ridge near the western pasture. The sun had just begun to rise, painting the hills with soft shades of pink and gold. John's sharp eyes caught the unusual impressions in the soil, human footprints, uneven and hurried, mingled with the tracks of horses. His heart tightened, not with fear but with resolve. The gang was near. They were watching, moving closer with every passing day. John returned to the ranch immediately, his mind working quickly. He knew that running was not an option. There was no town far enough to guarantee safety, and he had no interest in abandoning the land he had grown to love. Instead, he set about making the ranch defensible. He arranged the hay bales to create barriers, reinforced the barn windows with boards, and even laid out a few simple, clever traps around the perimeter. Nothing deadly. He was not cruel, but enough to give him an advantage if the intruders came. As the day went on, John could feel the tension in the air. The wind carried distant noises, the faint clatter of hooves on hard ground, the creaking of a fence in the distance. Every sound made him alert, but he did not panic. Instead, he studied the land, remembering every hill, every dip, every tree. This was his advantage. He knew every hiding place, every trail, every shortcut. The plains were open, yes, but they had their secrets, and he intended to use them. By mid-afternoon, a few neighbors rode by, cautiously circling the ranch. They stopped a safe distance away, their faces lined with worry. "John," one of them called, his voice carrying over the wind, "you really shouldn't stay here. They're dangerous." "You don't have a chance alone." John nodded politely but said nothing. Words could not change his mind. His eyes scanned the horizon, unblinking, as if the very land had given him permission to stay. He tipped his hat and waved them off. They rode away reluctantly, leaving him alone once more. Evening approached, and John began his nightly routine. He fed the animals, checked the fences again, and made sure the barn doors were secure. Then he mounted Rust and rode out along the ridge one last time, keeping watch as the sun sank behind the hills. The shadows lengthened, stretching across the plains like dark fingers. John felt a shiver of caution but also a surge of determination. He had made a choice and he would see it through. As darkness fell, the noises of the plains changed. The wind whispered differently, carrying with it unfamiliar sounds, branches breaking, small animals scurrying, and distant calls that could be mistaken for human voices. John's senses sharpened. He dismounted and led Rust into a small clearing near the ridge, letting the horse graze while he scanned the horizon. Hours passed slowly, and every movement in the shadows made him tense. Yet he did not feel fear. Fear was for those who chose to run. John had chosen to stay, and with that choice came responsibility and courage. Late into the night he heard it, a faint, unmistakable clatter. Someone was moving along the edge of the pasture. John's hand went instinctively to the rifle he kept by his side. He crept quietly through the darkness, keeping low, moving silently toward the sound. The moon had risen now, casting pale light across the land. He could see the shadows of two men moving near the fence. They were not careful. They did not know the land like he did. John waited, breathing evenly, calculating. Then, with a swift motion, he stepped out of the shadows and raised his voice. "I wouldn't go any closer if I were you." His tone was calm but firm, carrying across the field. The men froze, startled. John could see the fear in their eyes, the realization that they were not dealing with an ordinary rancher. He made a small gesture, pointing to the traps he had set earlier. The men hesitated, and after a tense moment, they turned and fled into the darkness, leaving their horses behind. John watched them go, his heart steady. This small victory gave him confidence, but he knew it was only the beginning. Returning to the ranch, John felt a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. He had defended the property without unnecessary violence, using his knowledge and preparation to gain the upper hand. Russ nickered softly as he approached, and John patted the horse's neck, whispering, "Good work, boy. We'll be ready for whatever comes next." Inside the cabin, he prepared a simple meal, sitting by the fire and reflecting on the day. The land was quiet now, but he knew the gang would return. They always did. And when they did, he would be ready. The nights were the hardest. Sleep came fitfully, and every sound, an owl hooting, the wind shifting, a branch snapping, made John's senses flare. Yet he found strength in the routine, in the familiarity of the land and the animals, and in the knowledge that he had chosen this path. He reminded himself that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. And John McCall had no intention of leaving. Days turned into weeks. The gang continued to roam the surrounding plains, sometimes near, sometimes far, always a shadow over the ranch. John adapted his routine, varying his patrols, observing the tracks, listening to the land. He began to predict the movements of the intruders, learning from their mistakes and using the plains to his advantage. Small victories kept him motivated. A calf saved, a trap that worked, a herd that stayed safe. Each success reinforced his belief that he could endure, that he could protect the land he loved. Despite the danger, there were moments of peace. John rode out in the early mornings, watching the sun rise over the horizon, feeling the wind on his face, and listening to the quiet hum of life on the plains. These moments reminded him why he stayed, why he had refused to run. The land was alive, full of beauty and resilience just like him. Every hill, every tree, every stream held a story, and John was a part of that story. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned shades of orange and violet, John stood at the edge of the pasture, looking out across the land. The herd grazed quietly, Russ nuzzled at a calf, and the wind carried the scent of wildflowers and grass. In that moment, John felt a deep sense of connection, a reminder that he was not just surviving. He was living fully, embracing the challenges and the beauty alike. He knew the gang would return, that danger was always near, but he also knew that he was ready. He had chosen to stay, and that choice gave him power. John McCall, the cowboy who refused to ride away, had become more than just a man on a ranch. He had become a symbol of courage and determination, a living testament to the strength found in love for the land, the animals, and the life one chooses to protect. The days ahead would test him, pushing him to his limits, but John was prepared. He had the skills, the knowledge, and the will to face whatever came, and he would, always. The plains stretched endlessly before him, wild and open, full of life and danger alike. And in the heart of it all, John McCall stood firm, ready to meet the wolves on his own terms. The days grew longer, and the tension around John McCall's ranch thickened like the morning mist that rolled over the plains. The gang that had once been a distant shadow was now moving closer. Their presence felt in every unusual sound, in every broken twig, and in the faint, hurried tracks he discovered near the pastures. John rose earlier than ever, knowing that the hours before dawn were the safest and the most strategic for observation. He often rode Rust along the edges of the property, scanning the horizon, watching the hills and valleys for any sign of the intruders. It was during one of these early morning patrols that John noticed something different. The tracks were more numerous than before, overlapping in a pattern that suggested they were studying his movements, learning his routine. His chest tightened with a mixture of frustration and determination. The gang was clever, but John had an advantage that no outsider could match. He knew every inch of this land. Every ridge, every hollow, every hidden trail was familiar to him, and he intended to use that knowledge to defend the ranch. Returning to the barn, he began reinforcing his earlier preparations. He checked the traps he had set along the perimeter, repaired sections of the fence that had weakened under storms, and moved some hay bales to create obstacles near the barn doors. Each small adjustment was deliberate, intended to slow any intruders and give him a chance to respond. John worked quietly, methodically, his mind constantly calculating the gang's possible movements. He had learned that anticipation was as important as strength. To survive, he had to think like them without becoming them. Even though the danger was real and ever-present, John did not allow it to consume him. He spent time with the animals, talking softly to the horses, brushing the cattle, and making sure that nothing was neglected. For him, tending the ranch was more than a chore. It was a form of meditation, a way to stay connected to the life he loved and to remind himself why he refused to flee. Rust nickered happily as he worked, a quiet companion in the loneliness of the plains. By late morning, John's vigilance was rewarded with small but telling signs. Tracks led from one ridge to another, and he noticed disturbances near the fence line that were clearly made by human hands. Someone had been close enough to test the defenses, but they had not dared approach the barn. John smiled grimly. The message was clear. They were bold, but they underestimated him. He would make them think twice before challenging the ranch again. Over the next few days, John adjusted his routines. He varied the times he rode out, changed the paths he followed, and even used decoys to confuse anyone watching from a distance. For instance, he would leave the barn door slightly open or scatter hay in one direction while he quietly moved in another. Small tricks, but effective. He began to feel a quiet satisfaction, a growing confidence that he could outsmart those who threatened his home. He also started noting the patterns in the gang's movements, the way they approached from certain hills, how they avoided open plains, and the sounds they made when scouting. Every observation became a tool, every detail a potential advantage. Yet despite his careful planning, the nights were still the hardest. The wind seemed louder in the dark, carrying every creak and rustle as if the world were conspiring against him. John often lay awake, listening, alert for the faintest sound of hooves or voices. Sometimes he thought he heard the distant echo of men laughing, a cruel reminder that the gang was still out there, waiting for the right moment. But he refused to let fear take root. Fear was only dangerous if it controlled your actions. John allowed it only as a reminder to remain vigilant. One afternoon, he decided to check the northern pasture, a section of the land that was slightly isolated from the main ranch. Riding quietly, he noticed a fresh trail leading through the tall grass. His pulse quickened, not with panic but with clarity. The intruders were near, and he had a chance to see them before they saw him. Dismounting Rust, he led the horse through a hidden path known only to him, approaching the tracks slowly. Soon he spotted them, two men, armed and moving cautiously, clearly expecting resistance. John stayed hidden, observing how they scouted the area, noting their lack of familiarity with the land. Rather than confronting them immediately, he let them pass. He wanted to learn more about their approach, their habits, and their weaknesses. By staying patient, he gained valuable information that he could use to protect the ranch more effectively. It was a tense game of observation and strategy, but John was patient, and patience was a skill he had honed over years of riding and working on the plains. The men disappeared into the distance, unaware of how closely they had been watched. Back at the ranch, John reinforced his traps and began thinking about longer-term strategies. He considered how he could create safe zones for the cattle, build barriers that would funnel the intruders into areas he could control, and even use the natural terrain to his advantage. He started teaching himself new techniques, experimenting with rope, wood, and ingenuity, all aimed at giving him an edge. Every success, every small improvement strengthened his confidence. He knew that one day the gang would return in full force, but he would be ready. The local townsfolk, though distant, began to notice the changes. A few brave neighbors rode past the ranch occasionally, curious about John's activities. Some admired his determination, others thought him foolish. Yet John paid little attention to their opinions. He knew what mattered: the safety of the land, the animals, and his own survival. He continued to prepare quietly, working from dawn until dusk, resting only when necessary and always alert to the sounds of the plains. It was during one particularly quiet evening that John realized the gang was adapting too. Tracks now suggested larger groups, moving carefully, avoiding obvious paths. They were studying him, just as he had studied them. A sense of urgency settled over him, but it was tempered by focus. He knew that anticipation, preparation, and cleverness would win where force alone might fail. He made small adjustments to the traps, reinforced vulnerable points, and devised escape routes for the animals if needed. Every action was calculated, deliberate, and necessary. One night, the air seemed heavier than usual. The wind carried distant sounds that John could not immediately identify. He mounted Rust and rode quietly along the ridge, scanning the hills for movement. Shadows shifted in the moonlight, and he knew instinctively that the gang was closer than ever. His heart beat steadily, not from fear, but from the surge of awareness and readiness. The world was quiet, tense, and alive, and he was at the center of it, fully alert and fully prepared. John returned to the ranch before dawn, checking the animals, the fences, and the traps once again. Everything was in order, but he felt the unmistakable weight of anticipation. The final confrontation would come soon. He could feel it in the air, in the behavior of the animals, and in the patterns of the gang's movements. They were closing in, circling like wolves, but John was ready. He had patience, preparation, and knowledge of the land on his side. In the early hours of the next morning, he noticed smoke in the distance. A small fire, likely a signal, had been lit near the western hills. The gang was making its presence known. John did not panic. He mounted Rust, rode along the ridge, and observed carefully. The fire's smoke revealed their positions, their numbers, and the way they moved. For the first time, he felt the full weight of the challenge ahead, but along with it came resolve. He would not abandon the ranch, and he would not let the land fall into their hands. John spent the rest of the day preparing for what he knew would be a confrontation. He reinforced weak points, created distractions, and planned routes to control the movement of the gang if they attacked. He trained his horse, Rust, for quick maneuvers, and made sure the cattle were ready to move if necessary. Each step he took was purposeful, focused, and strategic. He knew that his strength lay not only in courage, but in intelligence, foresight, and a deep understanding of the plains he called home. As the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the fields, John stood at the edge of the pasture, looking out over the land he had sworn to protect. The gang was near, and the night would be long, but he felt a quiet confidence. The plains were his ally, the land his shield, and he himself ready. He had spent years learning, preparing, and observing. Every trap, every barricade, every plan was in place. The final test was approaching, and John McCall was ready to meet it head-on. The cowboy who refused to ride away had become more than just a man on a ranch. He was a guardian, a strategist, and a symbol of resilience. The gang was closing in, but John's determination burned brighter than any fear. The plain stretched endlessly before him, alive with danger and beauty alike. And in the heart of it all, John stood firm, prepared to defend what he loved with every ounce of strength, wit, and courage he possessed. The night was unusually dark, with thick clouds covering the moon and stars. A heavy silence hung over the plains, broken only by the occasional rustle of the wind through the grass and the low sounds of the cattle in the corral. John McCall stood outside the barn, his hand resting lightly on Rust's mane, listening intently. He could feel it in his bones. Tonight would not be like the nights before. Tonight the gang would make their move. For weeks, John had been preparing, reinforcing fences, setting traps, and learning the movements of the men who threatened his ranch. But even with all that preparation, the anticipation of a direct attack was a test of courage unlike any he had faced before. The plains, which had always been his sanctuary, now felt like a stage on which danger might strike at any moment. Yet John remained calm. He had chosen this life, and he would meet the challenge with every ounce of strength he possessed. The first sign came as a faint clatter in the distance, the soft sound of hooves moving over hard ground. John's heart did not race. Instead, he listened carefully, analyzing the direction and speed of the movement. He estimated the number of men approaching based on the sound, and it confirmed what he had suspected. The gang had come prepared, and they were close. He mounted Rust and rode quietly along the ridge, his eyes scanning every shadow, every contour of the land. The intruders were clever, but John had patience and knowledge on his side. As he rode, he noticed small disturbances near the edge of the western pasture, tracks that had not been there before. The gang was testing his defenses, trying to figure out weaknesses. John slowed, studying the ground carefully. He realized they were likely trying to herd the cattle into an area where they could be captured more easily. He needed to act quickly. Returning to the barn, John began implementing his plan. He quietly guided the cattle into a safer part of the pasture, away from the areas he suspected the gang would target. He reinforced the gates and set up distractions, piles of hay, loose boards, and shallow trenches that would slow anyone trying to approach. Every detail mattered, and John worked with precision, understanding that the smallest mistake could have serious consequences. By late evening, the gang's approach became clearer. Flames from small fires flickered in the distance, signaling their positions and numbers. They were bold, confident that they could intimidate the lone cowboy into surrendering. But John had learned their patterns and anticipated their arrogance. He moved strategically, positioning himself and Rust to take advantage of every slope, every tree, and every shadow. He understood that knowledge of the land could be as powerful as any weapon. When the first men came within sight, John waited, letting them advance cautiously. They did not know he was ready. His traps, simple yet clever, slowed them as intended. A pile of hay toppled in the path, forcing one man to stumble and lose his balance. A hidden trench made another pause, giving John time to assess the situation. Each small success reinforced his confidence. He was not just defending the land, he was using it as an ally. The first confrontation came at the edge of the barn. The gang, confident and aggressive, attempted to rush in, expecting little resistance. John met them calmly, his rifle steady, his movements deliberate. He did not act out of anger but out of necessity and strategy. A sharp warning shot caused the intruders to halt, giving him the advantage to maneuver. He knew that panic could be dangerous for both sides, so he maintained a controlled presence, projecting authority and readiness. The fight escalated as more men approached. John used every skill he had learned over years on the plains. He guided Rust with precise commands, positioning the horse to block pathways and protect the animals. He used the terrain to his advantage, moving the intruders into areas where traps and obstacles slowed their progress. He remained calm, even as the sounds of shouting and movement filled the night air. Each decision was calculated, each action purposeful. As the hours passed, John realized that his endurance would be tested. The gang continued to push, using numbers to their advantage. But John had patience, determination, and knowledge. He avoided unnecessary confrontation, focusing on protecting the cattle, the barn, and the main ranch house. He lured some intruders into tricky terrain, forcing them to abandon their plans and retreat. The longer the confrontation lasted, the more the gang's confidence faltered. They had underestimated the cowboy who refused to ride away. At one point, John noticed a small group attempting to circle around the western side of the ranch. He quickly moved to intercept them, using a combination of shouting, strategic positioning, and minor obstacles to slow their advance. The men hesitated, unsure of the terrain and frustrated by unexpected resistance. John's calm, deliberate presence unnerved them. They had expected an easy victory, but instead faced a man who knew the land intimately and was prepared to defend it with skill and patience. By midnight, the battle reached a tense stalemate. The gang had tried multiple strategies, but John's preparation and knowledge of the land made their efforts ineffective. He guided the cattle to safer areas, reinforced the barn once more, and ensured that Rust remained calm and ready for sudden maneuvers. Every movement was deliberate, every action aimed at protecting what he loved. Despite exhaustion, John remained alert, understanding that the night was not yet over. As dawn approached, the gang began to retreat. They had suffered enough frustration to reconsider their approach. They had underestimated John's resilience, preparation, and connection to the land. Watching from a ridge, he saw them move away, their figures disappearing into the distance. A sense of relief washed over him, but it was tempered by awareness. The gang might return, stronger or more cunning, but John had proven that he could defend his home. He had not relied on luck. He had relied on preparation, knowledge, and determination. The first light of morning revealed the aftermath. The land bore small marks of struggle, disturbed soil, scattered hay, and a few broken branches, but nothing catastrophic. The cattle were safe, Rust stood nearby, and the barn had remained secure. John walked through the property, inspecting every area carefully. The traps and obstacles had worked as intended, giving him the upper hand without unnecessary harm to anyone. He felt a deep satisfaction, not from victory over others, but from the knowledge that his home and animals were protected. Neighbors began to appear, cautiously approaching the ranch. They had heard the sounds of the confrontation and wanted to know if John was safe. Their eyes reflected a mix of awe and relief. John greeted them simply, without prideful words. "The land is safe," he said. For now. His calm presence reassured them more than any explanation could. Word of his bravery and skill began to spread quietly through the plains, though John himself never sought recognition. His focus was always on the work, the land, and the animals. The events of the night left John exhausted but resolute. He knew that future challenges would come, that the gang might attempt new tactics or return in greater numbers. Yet he also knew that he had proven something important. Courage, preparation, and knowledge could stand against intimidation and threat. He had defended what was his, not with recklessness but with careful planning, patience, and strategic action. In the days that followed, John continued his routines, repairing any minor damage from the confrontation and improving defenses even further. He observed the land with renewed vigilance, aware that danger could return at any moment. Yet there was also a quiet pride, a satisfaction in knowing that he had faced the threat head-on and emerged successful. The plains, vast and wild, seemed to echo with this determination. They had tested him, and he had risen to the challenge. By the end of the week, the ranch had returned to a semblance of normalcy. The cattle grazed peacefully, rust roamed freely, and the wind carried a sense of calm across the plains. John stood at the edge of the pasture, looking out over the land he had fought to protect. He reflected on the nights of tension, the long hours of preparation, and the confrontation that had tested him in every way. He felt a deep connection to the land and a renewed sense of purpose. John McCall, the cowboy who refused to ride away, had faced the wolves and held his ground. He had defended his home, his animals, and his life with courage, skill, and intelligence. The experience strengthened his resolve, teaching him the value of preparation, observation, and patience. More than anything, it reminded him why he had chosen to stay, because this land was not just a place to live. It was a life worth protecting, a home worth defending, and a legacy worth maintaining. As the sun rose fully over the plains, casting light across the fields, John mounted Rust and rode along the ridge. The air was crisp, the land calm, and for the first time in many nights, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The gang had been repelled, the ranch remained intact, and he had proven that courage and careful planning could triumph over intimidation. The plains stretched endlessly before him, filled with life, challenge, and opportunity. And in the heart of it all, John McCall stood firm, ready to face whatever came next. The plains were calm once more, bathed in the soft light of morning. The wind carried the familiar scent of grass and wildflowers, and the low hum of the cattle grazing in the pastures reminded John McCall of why he had chosen to stay. After the long nights of vigilance, the tense standoff with the gang, and the countless hours of preparation, there was a quiet peace over the ranch. Yet John knew that peace was fragile. The world beyond the fences was unpredictable, and danger could return at any time. Even so, he welcomed this moment of calm. It was a reward for perseverance, courage, and determination. John rose early, as always, feeling the cool touch of dawn on his face. He walked to the corral, greeting Rust with a gentle pat on the neck. The horse nickered softly in response, as if acknowledging the relief of surviving the previous trials. John moved among the cattle, checking on each one carefully. The animals had grown accustomed to his presence, sensing the calm confidence that had guided him through the previous nights of danger. He smiled quietly to himself. They were safe, and that meant the land he loved was protected. The events of the past weeks had changed something in John. He had faced threats that tested his courage and skill, and he had prevailed. But more than that, he had gained a deeper understanding of the land, of the animals, and of the human spirit. Each day of preparation, each trap set, each hour of observation had strengthened not only his defenses but also his resolve. He knew that living on the plains was not just about survival. It was about respect for the land and the life it sustained. By mid-morning, a few neighbors began to ride toward the ranch. Word had spread of John's steadfast defense, and curiosity and admiration drew them closer. Some brought supplies, while others simply wanted to see the man who had refused to abandon his home. John greeted them simply, with a nod and a quiet acknowledgement. He did not boast of his victories or dwell on the confrontation with the gang. For him, the work and the land were what mattered most. Yet he could see the respect in their eyes, the recognition that courage and determination could inspire others. As the day progressed, John began repairing minor damage from the recent events. The fences were reinforced, the barn doors checked, and the traps carefully reset, not for immediate use but as a precaution. He worked methodically, taking pride in the small details that ensured the ranch remained secure. Every nail hammered, every post tightened, and every repair made him feel connected to the land in a way that went beyond ownership. This was his home, and he would care for it with unwavering dedication. In the afternoon, John rode out to the western ridge, the same path where he had first observed the gang's approach. From this vantage point, he could see the expanse of the plains stretching endlessly before him. The land looked peaceful, yet he knew its beauty held hidden challenges. He reflected on the events that had unfolded, the threats, the preparation, the confrontation, and felt a quiet pride in his endurance. He had faced the wolves, figuratively and literally, and had not faltered. The ranch had become more than a place to live. It had become a symbol. John realized that his determination to stay, despite the warnings and danger, inspired others. It was not just courage in the face of threats. It was a deep respect for one's responsibilities, a commitment to protect what one loved. The neighbors who had once doubted him now spoke of his resilience and wisdom. Some came to ask for advice on defending their own properties, and John shared what he knew freely. He taught them about preparation, observation, and using the land to one's advantage. In doing so, he strengthened not only his own ranch but the spirit of the entire community. As evening approached, John led Rust back to the barn and checked on the cattle one last time. The sky was painted in hues of gold and orange, and the wind carried a sense of calm over the plains. He allowed himself a moment to sit on a fence post, looking out across the land he had protected. Memories of the long nights, the strategic maneuvers, and the tense confrontations filled his mind. He thought of the gang, the neighbors, and the lessons he had learned. Each moment had shaped him, reinforced his values, and reminded him why he had chosen to stay. That night, John prepared for bed with a sense of accomplishment. He had faced danger, protected his land, and ensured the safety of the animals he cared for. Yet he knew that true peace required vigilance. Living on the plains demanded respect for the elements, for the wildlife, and for the unpredictable nature of human threats. John accepted this truth willingly, understanding that the challenges he faced were part of the life he had chosen. Sleep came with a sense of satisfaction rather than fear, a reward for courage and preparation. Over the following weeks, life on the ranch began to settle into a new rhythm. John continued his daily routines, feeding the cattle, checking the fences, and patrolling the land, but there was a renewed sense of confidence. He knew that the gang might return, but he was ready. The land had become a partner, each ridge and hollow an ally in maintaining safety. John's careful planning, observation, and courage had turned potential threats into lessons in strategy and endurance. Visitors from the nearby town began to stop by more frequently, drawn by stories of the cowboy who had refused to leave. Some were curious, others respectful, and a few sought guidance. John welcomed them, sharing his knowledge without pride or arrogance. He explained the importance of preparation, awareness, and respect for the land. Through these interactions, he realized that his actions had a broader impact beyond the boundaries of his own ranch. His courage had become a quiet inspiration, a reminder that determination and careful planning could overcome fear and intimidation. One morning, as John rode along the ridge with Rust, he reflected on the choices that had brought him here. Many men might have left, fleeing from danger to seek safety elsewhere. But he had stayed, not out of stubbornness alone, but out of love for the land, the animals, and the life he had built. The plains had tested him, but they had also taught him resilience, patience, and the value of foresight. Each sunrise, each gentle breeze, and each moment of calm after danger reinforced his understanding of what it meant to truly belong to the land. By late afternoon, John returned to the barn and began tending to small projects that had been postponed during the recent chaos. He repaired a section of the corral, mended tools, and organized supplies. Each task reminded him that life on the plains was built on consistent effort and attention to detail. The work was not glamorous, but it was meaningful. It connected him to the land, to the animals, and to the principles that guided his life: courage, responsibility, and perseverance. Neighbors continued to admire John's resilience. Some sought his advice on managing their own ranches, while others simply came to witness the man who had refused to abandon his home. John treated each visitor with respect and humility, offering guidance and sharing lessons learned from his experiences. He understood that strength was not only in facing danger, but also in teaching others to protect what they valued. In this way, his legacy began to extend beyond the boundaries of his ranch. As the sun began to set, John walked along the edge of the pasture, watching Rust graze peacefully. The sky was a canvas of orange and pink, and the wind whispered gently through the grass. He reflected on the journey he had undertaken, the warnings, the preparation, the confrontations, and the victories. Each moment had reinforced a single truth: courage was not the absence of fear, but the commitment to act despite it. John had faced the wolves, both literal and figurative, and had remained steadfast. That night, as John lay in his simple cabin, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The ranch was safe, the cattle were unharmed, and Rust rested nearby. He thought about the challenges he had overcome and the lessons he had learned. Living on the plains demanded vigilance, strategy, and courage, but it also offered unmatched beauty, freedom, and a sense of belonging. John closed his eyes, knowing that he had honored the land and protected what mattered most. The following morning, John rose early once again, as the plains stretched endlessly before him. He mounted Rust and rode along familiar trails, feeling the wind against his face and the sun's warmth on his back. The world was alive with sounds and movement, a reminder that life continued despite the challenges. John's mind was calm, his heart steady, and his spirit unyielding. He had proven to himself, and to those around him, that determination, preparation, and love for one's home could overcome even the most daunting threats. John McCall, the cowboy who refused to ride away, had earned not only the respect of his neighbors but also a deeper understanding of himself and the land he cherished. His story became one of inspiration, a testament to courage, resilience, and the enduring human spirit. He had faced danger, endured hardship, and emerged stronger, with a renewed sense of purpose and connection to the plains. As he rode into the distance, the sun rising fully over the hills, John felt a quiet pride. The ranch, the animals, and the land were safe. He had met the wolves and stood his ground, proving that true courage came from love, preparation, and steadfastness. The plains stretched endlessly before him, filled with life, challenge, and beauty. And at the heart of it all, John McCall rode on, unyielding, steadfast, and free, a cowboy who had refused to ride away.